Good evening. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. My name is Gabriela Resto Montero. I am the Senior Journalism Director at Rocky Mountain PBS here in Buell Theater. Oh, thanks, guys. These are my colleagues in public media who you will be meeting here shortly. I wanted to thank all of you and also acknowledge that all of us who care about the news, and I'm assuming that you all care about the news and free information because you're here with us tonight, are obviously following what's happening in Minneapolis very, very closely. And I wanted to thank you for coming here and for wanting to be a part of this conversation. I had a journalism professor who traded a concert tee I really wanted for me memorizing the First Amendment, which is, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. That is what we stand on here today and every day, and that is why I'm assuming you are all here. Thank you so much for supporting our work in that effort. We will be discussing that at length today. But yes, I just wanted to say thank you for being here, and that what's going on in Minneapolis is really, for me as a news director, showing the power of the record, keeping a record of what happens in our communities, keeping a record of what our government does in our name, for us, by us, and to us. And it's really reaffirmed my commitment as a journalist, certainly. And I feel activated to continue to do the work that we do. And I just wanted to, there's been phenomenal reporting on the ground. The Minneapolis Star-Tribune, if you're not following them, they're doing beautiful work. Minneapolis Public Radio has also been doing phenomenal work on the ground. The local reporting has really been powerful, it has been connected, it has been responsive, and it has challenged official accounts at every turn with evidence, with support, with reporting. And it's really the best work that we can possibly do. Toni Morrison said, this is a time when artists get to work. It's also the time when journalists get to work. And I just wanted to read this from Adam Serwer. He's on the ground in Minneapolis. And he wrote this for The Atlantic, and I think that this also characterizes this gathering here today. He says, the resistance in Minnesota is largely characterized by a conscious strategic absence of physical confrontation. If the Minnesota resistance has any overarching ideology, you could call it neighborism, a commitment to protecting the people around you, no matter who they are or where they come from. So with that, thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Larry Reichman from the Colorado Sun. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, thanks for joining us tonight. This is, for me personally, this film is a step back in time. I've been a journalist for more than 40 years, and I'm much more accustomed to being behind the camera or being the guy asking the questions. So it's kind of fun, scary for me to find myself on the other end of it and to look back in time at where we were 8 years ago. This is an important film, and I'm really glad that you've all taken time out to come see it. Rick Goldsmith is a serious filmmaker. He's twice been nominated for Academy Awards for his documentaries. And this film is so important. It not only helps explain what's happening, which is very important, but why it matters. And one other thing to keep in mind, this is a film about newspapers and journalists losing their jobs, but it's really not about journalists or even journalism. It's about all of us. You know, what kind of country do we want to live in? What kind of society do we want to live in? And, you know, journalism plays such a critical role in our society, in our country, and even from the founding fathers, they recognize the importance of a free press to the kind of society that we all should aspire to live in. So, in any event, happy that you're out here tonight. The Colorado Sun, you'll see our launch nearly 8 years ago. We launched with 10 people. Today we're 27, and thrilled to be doing this important work for you as a nonprofit. So thanks for coming out. I'm going to introduce to you Jeff Roberts, who's the head of the Colorado Freedom of Information Coalition. Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks, Hi, everybody. I'll be really brief. I'm Jeff Roberts. I'm the Executive Director of the Colorado Freedom of Information Coalition, and we're presenting this here tonight with the Sun and our partners at Rocky Mountain PBS. If you don't, excuse me, if you're not aware of the Colorado Freedom of Information Coalition, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about it. We are a nonprofit. We're a support system for local journalism in Colorado. So we're a nonprofit that educates the public and journalists about their rights under the open government laws. So the public records laws, the open meetings law, the court access rules. We advocate for government transparency and press freedom. So we play a supporting role, and we hear from journalists and people in the public every day who have questions about their rights under these laws, and we try to help them, and we get lawyers involved when that's necessary. So we're happy to be part of this program tonight. It means also a lot to me personally as a former Denver Post reporter and editor, which was a lot of my career. So we will be having a panel discussion immediately afterwards. So enjoy the film. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kimberly Spencer, and I am the director of the Colorado Media Project. We are a funding entity that supports a healthy ecosystem in Colorado so that all Coloradans can have access to critical local news and information. I want to take a moment just to kind of echo what Gabriella said earlier. I think all of us this weekend watched something horrific, many, many times happening in Minneapolis. And for me, as tragic as it was and as horrific, it really brought home for me how important having local reporters on the ground is. And I also just want to thank, the world is really heavy right now. So coming out and being part of this tonight, just thank you for that. It just, I think for me, brings a little bit of hope that we're not in this alone. We're kind of all of us are in this together. This movie, I think it's not just a documentary. It's our history. It's here. It's the story of the Denver Post and the Colorado Sun and what happens when people say, hey, we're going to stand up for community, which is what so many people that left the Sun did. So just want to thank them for that and just really appreciate how special Colorado is. So I know this movie really focused on consolidation of newspapers, but recently, I don't know how many of you are aware of some potential changes to FCC rules around ownership. So we are actually going to focus this conversation on broadcast and really on what potentially could be happening in Denver with the Nexstar and TEGNA merger and kind of what does that mean for Colorado communities. I want to, before we get started, really introduce our panelists. So here we have Corey Hutchins, who is the author of In the News, Colorado, and is also a professor of journalism at Colorado College. We have Nathan Schneider, who is a professor at CU Boulder, who is studying the intersection of technology, ownership, and cooperative models. And Laura Frank, the executive director of the Colorado News Cooperative, who works with newsrooms across the entire state to strengthen community reporting. So thank you all for joining me this evening. I just want to one more thing about Minneapolis, which I think is important context, is that this isn't, when we see those things happening, it's not just something that's happening away. Unfortunately, both of the victims in Minneapolis have a connection to Colorado. So Renee Good grew up in Colorado Springs, and Alex Preddy, his family actually lives in Denver. So this is our community. These are our neighbors. These are people that have been affected by what's happening in other states. And it's the reporting from the Minneapolis Star Tribune, the Sahan Journal, and stations like KARE 11 that really are doing the work for verification and accountability. And just imagine what would happen if we didn't have those resources on the ground there to know what was going on. Because I think it's really important to note that right now we have an official account of what happened that is completely opposite of what we all saw with our own eyes. And so that is the what local journalism brings to communities. It's that accountability. It's that truth telling. So tonight I really want to focus on what happens when we have consolidation, what happens when we have mergers, and how does it affect what happens on the ground in that local reporting? So Corey, I want to start with you. You have documented the colony collapse of newsrooms on the Eastern Plains, but now we're starting down a broadcast monopoly. Why does a merger in Denver threaten the information access of a rancher in Yuma or family in the San Luis Valley?
Sure. First of all, I'll say something happened after this film came out that didn't make it in the film, but you saw what the hedge fund did to the Denver Post with laying people off. After the film came out, or at least after he'd been working on it, the hedge fund closed a couple of newspapers in Colorado, and they were on the Eastern Plains. And then others, 5, 6, collapsed as well, not owned by the hedge fund, and we lost some in the San Luis Valley within the past year. So it's an accelerating trend. I was encouraged, I was glad to see some of the stuff about legislation and politicians in there at the end, because I feel like a sentiment throughout the film was that this is just kind of a feature of neoliberal late capitalism, and there may not be much we can do about it. It's just like the weather. But there are people who can do something about it. And when it comes to broadcast, I think the message that I think we have for you tonight is that what you just saw here talked a lot about newspapers, but now this kind of economic market failure, if you want to call it that, is coming for the broadcasters too. So in Colorado, where I live in Colorado Springs, that will mean a merger will shrink the ownership of the local broadcast stations in my city from 4 to 2. And in Denver, if this takeover goes through, it will basically have Fox 21, that's what you call KDVR, subsume 9 News. And 9 News, I would say, is probably the best at watchdog journalism and accountability journalism on TV in the entire state. So what does a rancher in Yuma lose if we lose 9 News? That's in the whole Eastern Plains and southeastern Colorado and all the way up north. That's in the Denver, what's called the DMA. And so that's where people out there are getting news and information. Just recently, 9 News did a really good investigation on a small town called Kersey. It's about an hour away in northern Weld County, investigating the law enforcement's appetite for using these speed cameras that give you $350 tickets or something like that. And after the investigation came out, multiple stories, the town council decided to refund all those tickets, and they're not going to do this anymore. Without 9 News, does that happen? I don't think so. And so what is the next town that's not Kersey but is somewhere else where a reporter for 9 News won't be? That's what somebody loses. A citizen stood up in the town meeting the other day, a couple weeks, whenever it was, last week, and basically said to the government to their face, you know, you really are only changing this because 9 News came and stepped in. So what we lose is somebody not being able to step into a community anywhere.
Thank you. Nathan, what we're hearing is that, these broadcasters are arguing that they have to merge to be able to compete with big tech. So the Googles, the Facebooks, the Metas. If the FCC loosens these rules, are we moving towards a world where algorithms and private equity determine the public record for the entire state?
I'm glad you raised that, because I think that is just such a fundamental category error, right? To imagine that, that first of all, that these companies by merging are going to be able to compete with global platforms that are orders of magnitude larger and more powerful in any kind of direct way. They are completely misrepresenting the story here. And second, I think it's really important to understand that for many people, for better or worse, algorithms already are feeding their primary news diet. I teach classes at CU Boulder. I'm often asking at the beginning of class, what stories did you see today, and where did you find them? Almost always, they are seeing things that are coming up in their feeds, and I really appreciated what that what this film expressed at the end, that the primary material for all of that is coming from reporters who are not working for any of those algorithmic platforms. These are fundamentally different parts of the ecosystem, and they need to behave differently. And there's a reason that public policy has long prevented this kind of consolidation. This is stuff where local participation matters, whereas algorithmic platforms are all designed around one-size-fits-all models, not local attention. Meta has a one-size-fits-all rule book for the entire world. And that's the last thing we need for local news. So we must not allow this to. And we also need to recognize one thing that these stories do have in common, that the platforms and the broadcasters and the journalists do have in common, is they're part of a political power play. Rules are being changed as part of a game of political power consolidation in the media. In the same way that when the current administration took office, it weaponized lawsuits in order to win compliance from all the major tech companies. It is now weaponizing FCC regulation to ensure that its allies are able to consolidate power over reporting and broadcast and more. So we need to see this for what it is, and be really critical of the story that's being told about why this is justifiable.
Thank you. Laura, to you, you see the fallout on the ground. When we lose local journalists, our first line of accountability, do we lose the ability to verify the truth?
We absolutely do. CoLab, the Colorado News Collaborative, works with nearly 200 news organizations across the state, and we, along with the Media Project and the Press Association, survey news organizations every year. And our most recent survey, 156 of those news organizations answered, and we asked things like, how many people do you have producing the reporting, producing the news, and how many people do you have doing everything else that it takes to operate a news organization? And the most recent results, does anybody want to take a guess at that the typical newsroom, so this is not the average that might be pulled one way or the other by a large newsroom or a very small newsroom, the median number of people producing content in a typical Colorado newsroom, does anyone want to guess? 8. I'm hearing 8. I'm hearing 2, 3. 2 is closer. It was 1.35. Yes. I don't know if the recording can pick up on the gasps on that, but yes, 1.35. Imagine the kinds of things in any community that have to be covered. All the things that we watched in this film, all the things that we know we want to know about in our communities, our schools, our businesses, the seats of power, the government, local, state, federal. 1.35 people. And then to do everything else that it takes to support that was 1. So 2 1/3 people running the typical news organization in Colorado, and those are serving our communities, all your communities, all the communities that are represented out there. And what we see, we're talking about the potential merger, the acquisition by Nexstar of the TEGNA stations. That will not be as dramatic as what we've seen. I worked at the Rocky Mountain. I was an investigative reporter at the Rocky Mountain News when it closed. That was almost overnight. In about 3 months, it went from we're going to try to sell it to we're closing it. And it was very dramatic. Nearly 200 journalists gone almost overnight. This isn't like that. What we're facing with the potential merger is a a disappearance of the people who are doing. Kyle Clark probably isn't going to disappear. That will make my 14-year-old very happy because he thinks Kyle Clark walks on water. But what will happen is the people who are producing and researching and photographing, all of those begin to disappear. So we're seeing that on the dramatic level, the kind of thing that we're seeing in this film. But then what's happening on the local level is that attrition, that we're losing people, not necessarily because of hedge funds, but because the business model doesn't work the way that it used to. So we're seeing both of these things converge, and the end result is there aren't enough people to check all the facts and try to get ahead of the misinformation. And we're all suffering because of that.
Yeah, thank you. Corey, I know you track outlets and closures, and can you share how many outlets across the state have closed in, I don't know, the last 20 years, 15 years, however long you've been tracking?
Yeah, let me think. All right, if you go, let's say from 2004 to 2019, I think it's 52 newspapers across Colorado. I think 19 of those were just in like the past couple of years before that data came out. Since then, it's been several more, several more. Well, it's now 2026. I think I've counted. So I write a newsletter every Friday called Inside the News in Colorado, where I write about the local news industry. And so I'm tracking this on a weekly basis. And I wrote an end of the year column for the Colorado Sun. And I believe I wrote that close to 24 newspapers had gone out of business across the state within the past year or so. So this is an accelerating trend, clearly. And what's also kind of interesting about it is that while some of those closures came at the claws of the hedge fund that we just learned about, some of them are closing for entirely different reasons, particularly ones in rural areas. And that is just because it's not that they've run out of money. And I'm not sure what's more sad, actually. It's not just that they ran out of money. They didn't. They're actually making a profit, doing okay. It's that they ran out of people in the community willing to run the paper when the owner is ready to retire. And so we just lost the Lyman Leader not too long ago, a few weeks ago, had its last edition. And its publisher said, I would love to keep this paper around. Somebody should buy it. Nobody wanted to. Nobody in the community stepped up. The next one to go is probably in Lake City on the other side of the state. The guy there started the paper out of college. It's the only thing he's ever done in his career, and now just wants to retire and is looking for somebody either out of state or in state or in the community to buy it, and is having a hard time. So a variety of reasons for why this is happening, but it is happening. It's happening more, and it's happening faster.
Yeah, I asked you to share that because I always kind of think as broadcast as the backup plan. So if a local community loses their local paper, they can turn on the TV and get news from Channel 9 or Channel 7 or or turn on the radio. That's always been the backup plan. So now that we're seeing potential, mergers and those things within the state, some of that backup plan potentially is going away.
Yeah, it's going to be fewer choices, and the people like and the high finance C-suites and stuff. They're going to put out press releases when they merge, and they're going to say that this is good for journalism. This is going to be better or for the communities. This just won't be true. It'll mean fewer reporters there to look under those rocks, to be in those meetings in those small towns and places. And so I don't believe that these mergers are actually going to be good for the output, and there's going to be more people there to do the work. I mean, you just saw all that. Those were about newspapers. And again, looking around the corner, this could come to local TV broadcasts. And of course, you probably know what's going on with local public radio as well. And again, political decision here to defund public radio. That's another backup, is on the radio airwaves, particularly in the smaller communities that have small local radio stations, and they're the ones that are providing the critical information needs in their communities, like whether they're having sloppy joes on Sunday for veterans at the town hall or something like that.
Right. Yeah. Nathan, I know that you study kind of cooperative models, and I know this has been little bit of a depressing conversation. So would love to just infuse a little bit of hope. What are some alternatives? Can you talk a little bit about the cooperative models that you've been studying?
Yeah, more than studying. So one piece of this story is that I got to experience was when the Colorado Sun was first forming. I held got together with Larry and Dana and when they were first designing the business. And one of the things that was so exciting was that they had just learned the importance of ownership, because they had just seen how badly it can go wrong. And so, as you saw in the film, they were insistent on ensuring that the Colorado Sun would be owned by the journalists. Now, we've ended up transitioning toward a model that's more about journalist governance of a nonprofit model. But one way or another, recognizing that ownership is your defense. And that they wanted to create, one way of thinking about what they were trying to do is trying to create something that was resistant to capture. The reason that these newspapers could be captured, like that we saw with the Tribune story, is because of their publicly traded structure, because of their ownership structure. And that became, in some sense, a power because it opened them to capital markets, but it also became a vulnerability. And that's a big part of the story that's going on here. And a big part of the story about these nonprofit models is that they are much more capture resistant. They can block. They're just not vulnerable to that kind of takeover. Now, the idea of co-ownership of different sorts, something that has a long history in this state. And actually, Colorado is better positioned than any other state in the country policy-wise for conversions, especially to employee ownership. And so this is a tool that we can use to try to stem the tide here. We've just now seen the approval of new provisions that cover 75% of conversion costs and that provide loan guarantees for the conversion process from the state to ensure that banks have a reason to participate and ensure that the workers at these companies don't have to put up their own capital in order to actually become the owners of these businesses. So here in Colorado, we're very lucky to have the opportunity. I think we have to do a bit more to connect the dots about how we can apply this opportunity in journalism. An organization that I co-founded called Start.coop, which supports co-ops nationally, is now undertaking a big initiative to support new kinds of cooperative models, both those worker-owned models as well as national collaborations among these emerging smaller outlets that are coming online. And I think of a real inspiration as one of the bedrocks of our media ecosystem. I often ask our students, who do we look to call the American elections, right? Any guesses? The AP, they'll say things like, oh, the Electoral College or something. It's like, y'all are so smart, but that's not for weeks. I'm talking about the night of. It's the AP, right? A cooperative business going back to the 1830s that was built and is trustworthy because it's co-owned by newspapers and their owners who hate each other, right? And that kind of model creates a resilience. It creates, again, a capture resistance. And it's those kinds of things that we need to turn to now.
So I want to open this up, and anybody on the panel can answer this. So, what we saw this weekend in Minneapolis, what we see when there is, a wildfire in Colorado, what we see when, there is some type of emergency. How does consolidation threaten our ability to get verified facts during a crisis? Beyond just fewer reporters, are there other ways that consolidation threatens that?
yes, the facts, and it's the worst when there's serious breaking news, like the examples you just gave, or enterprise investigative reporting, like the story in Kersey that you were talking about. But there are other elements of this. When you start to see this kind of consolidation, it becomes more difficult for local businesses to buy an ad or give a sponsorship of some kind because those prices go up. Because when when the hedge fund is harvesting that money, they are not really interested in getting that information to people. They're interested in capitalizing and maximizing their profits. So we see the cost of ads go up, and local businesses have trouble. And that makes it more difficult for them to stay in business. That's why they referenced it in the film just briefly, but there's really, really good research about what happens if people don't have local sources of reliable news. And we see things like the cost of business going up, the cost of borrowing money going up, the polarization increases when people don't know what's happening in their community. It casts a pall over the whole community, and it's really hard to understand your neighbors or yourselves if you can't see that. So there are all kinds, like really every element of life can be affected when you see this kind of consolidation or the weakening, both, of local news.
Yeah. Nathan, Corey, you want to add anything to that?
I do wonder about costs going up after mergers for individuals, though, and if they would then turn to something else that's not local and therefore not be able to know what was going on if there is something in an emergency like that.
I think of one non-local case, which is a platform that, probably every Coloradan should have on their phone, Watch Duty, an app that gives you kind of real-time information about fire. It's an interesting case because it's actually kind of similar to this story. It was created as a nonprofit, built around the idea that trustworthy information in a moment of crisis should be a public good, right? And I think about that all the time. Whenever we have a fire, I'm scrolling on all the feeds, and X is giving me all kinds of crap that I don't want. It's out of. I can't get the latest stuff. Some of the alternatives are too small to really get enough information, and it's just when you're trying to decide whether to get your family out of there or not. You need to not have to think about these things. You need to just be able to have a trustworthy source. I'm always refreshing the Colorado Sun when these fires are happening and places like that, because I know, that they have my best interests at heart, that they're doing the best they can to get the best information they can, and it's just we shouldn't have to. You hear that phrase a lot, do your own research. This expectation gets placed on the individual to figure out in a messy media ecosystem what's trustworthy. And part of building a healthy ecosystem is to have institutions that in a moment like that you really can trust. And that, again, depends on the question of ownership. And it depends on the question of structure. That means that you don't have to second guess what's going on in a moment where you have to make quick decisions.
If I could just stay in that same vein and following up, keeping what you were saying, Kimberly, about a little bit of hope, we also in Colorado are really lucky in that news organizations have a long history of collaborating together. So when there are difficult things, like at the beginning of the pandemic, we were able, I think it was maybe 24 news organizations then. Now we're 200 collaborating together. But at the start of the pandemic, we were able to collaborate together to cover and get answers about the pandemic that single news organizations were having trouble getting at all, because you couldn't even have a press conference or go to do an interview. But we were able to bring people together to ask questions of the officials at that time. And that has continued through to now. In fact, coverage of immigration around the state. We are working together to share the same set of facts that people don't have to go and try to figure out all over again, to help local reporters understand how the law works and what they're able to get information-wise and not. And we provide access to data sets that help them get public records like Julie was getting in the film. So we have a history here of being able to collaborate in a way that can make up for some of the downsides that we're talking about tonight.
I want to just offer an alternate history, because we did watch a movie that's it makes Colorado look pretty bad about what happened here. But without the trauma that Alden Global Capital inflicted on Colorado, we would not have an organization called the Colorado Sun that we've talked a lot about in positive terms today. We would not have an organization called the Colorado Media Project, which you represent, and has pumped millions of dollars into local news organizations across the state. And we might not have the Colorado News Collaborative, which you represent, that creates this connective tissue and all that collaboration that you're talking about. Not sitting here saying like, oh, it's really great what they did, but it's really interesting to understand that if we could wind the clock back to 2018 and it doesn't happen, what does the news system, like the news scene in Colorado, look like? Is it actually stronger or not because of all that happened? Something to think about.
Yeah, that's a good perspective. Nathan, I want to go back to something that you said about people needing to verify information and do their, and I think a trend that we're seeing, and Corey, correct me if I'm wrong, I think we're seeing people, because they don't, I mean, we have the luxury, I often say, I have the luxury to read something or see something in a social media feed and go verify at 3 or 4 different places to see if it's true. A lot of people are hopping on to Nextdoor. A lot of people are hopping on to Reddit. And really what I think the reason is those are almost virtual communities. So I might not know the person in a subreddit, but I've seen their name enough times that when they share a story, I'm just going to assume that it's factual and I don't need to fact check it. So I think when we have fewer news sources that are vetted, that have reporters doing the work, asking the hard questions, people are going to look for easy alternatives because nobody has a lot of time. I often think of the single mom working a double shift. Does she have enough time to look and see whatever information that may have came out from her child's school? She's going to look at it and take it for face value. If we don't have a reporter there or someone's not there covering and not asking those questions, she's just getting information fed to her. People often say, well, I can get my news on social media, but it's all about who's putting the information in for what you're getting out. And I think that is the role of journalism. We heard about it here. Think about, it's so interconnected. When you have broadcast stations talking about, referencing print publications, vice versa, it really is we don't have enough reporters to cover everything. So we have to figure out how do we share and how do we get information to people that's easy to access, that's trustworthy, where they don't have to go in a subreddit with somebody that they don't know and assume that they are getting good information.
No, I think I'm glad you raised that. And I think both play a role. I mean, when I saw the images of the Nation, I always get kind of a chill because I used to report for the Nation, other magazines like that. And, what they put you through in the fact-checking process is the most humbling thing, like academic peer review doesn't hold a candle. I mean, having an intern re-report your story and point out all of the ways in which you were wrong is just totally devastating and absolutely necessary. That's an institutional function that is irreplaceable, that you can only do when you have people with jobs doing a thing. And nobody, you are not going to crowdsource that kind of work. And so that's one piece. But I do think there is a role for healthy community spaces. We've always had those kinds of spaces in one form or another. And I think the challenge is how do we make sure that those spaces are really set up to serve those communities? I don't know what your experience on Nextdoor is like, but it is, for me, when I open it up, it's like absolute panic, and again, another anxiety attack, right? Which is oh, racist person over here, and some kind of something's burning down over here, and it is just absolute mayhem, and it's trigger, and the algorithm is pushing this. Reddit, it really depends on the community, because the communities have, I think, really interesting a lot of leeway in how they operate. One organization I collaborate with quite a bit is called New Public, and they're, I think, very wisely an organization built out of people who are social media veterans. The leaders are the founder of MoveOn and former executive at Meta who had enough, and they're really interested in how social media platforms can learn from older kinds of public spaces, like the watering hole, or the park, or the library. And they've actually been building or preparing to release a new platform called Roundabout that, again, is built not on the basis of making profit as the primary motivation, but on the basis of serving communities as the primary motivation. And I think as the wildfire spreads, and I think as Silicon Valley turns its attention to AI and all this kind of stuff, it's actually an opportunity for us to rebuild those social spaces and get the incentives right. You look at Wikipedia compared to like your average Facebook feed, right? And it's a very different online experience because of the culture and the incentives and the design of the platform, and the fact that it's a nonprofit, not designed to maximize eyeballs, but to get the facts right. And so I think we're starting to have a moment where we can actually try again and build those platforms, not as a replacement for real journalism, not as a replacement for the work of news gathering and production, but as a complement that is, again, built on the basis of trust and collective intelligence, rather than the message that unfortunately I hear a lot from students, that they feel like they are alone and they have to verify everything that comes along. That is an impossible task. This is something, one way or another, and hopefully many ways, we have to do together.
Thank you. So one last question before we open it up to you all, in case you all have questions. Actually, there's two questions. So let's bring it back to the FCC rule change. So if this goes through, and we've talked about some of the things that might happen, Corey, let's start with you. What are the early warning signs that a station is starting to lose its local focus? What should people be watching for?
What I worry about is the stations, putting more national broadcast content on there. That's just not about local news in the community. You can already see, if you're watching some of the 4 stations in Denver, flip through sometimes. How many of you do that? I'm just curious, or if you have like one that you just stick with. How many of you flip through all 4? Not many. Try a different one day and try and see if you can see the difference, and maybe keep notes. How much of it is national content versus local content? How long? And if we start to see more of that, then I think you kind of know what's happening. It's cost saving, means they're not relying on the output of local journalists in the community.
So let me follow up with this question. So as someone that is a regular news consumer like you are, what would you, if you started to see that, how would you start to supplement where you get your news?
I mean, I'm different because I just try to read as much news as possible, but that's part of my job. So I wouldn't necessarily say that everybody should have to do that. But that's just what I do.
Yeah.
I use the Google News function and actually seek out news and information, and use the time function that lets me go last month, last week, last 24 hours. And I have multiple social media platforms that I can put keywords in and keep track on. But some of these I have to pay for to do. So again, I just wouldn't expect everybody else to have to do that either. They shouldn't have to, is the point.
Yeah, I agree. How about you, Nathan? What are early warning signs that you would share with folks that they should be looking out for, that their station has lost its local focus or is starting to?
Forgive me for using one of my little jargony phrases from a recent academic article, but the thing to watch out for is innovation amnesia. It's when a new technology becomes the excuse for doing away with rules that are good, right? So for instance, you think about the way Uber showed up and suddenly we didn't care about taxi regulation anymore, or we didn't care about labor law anymore. Similarly, when someone says, well, there's the internet, so now we can't care about laws designed to maintain competition and diversity in local news ecosystems, that's something to be worried about.
Laura?
I would say be on the lookout for more stories that are framed around official statements, not original reporting on the ground by people who live in the community and are reporting in the community. One of the things that I worry about most with this potential consolidation that we're talking about, including here in Denver, does anyone remember the Soviet Union? They had a news service called TASS, and they would get their information from the government, and it would have an ulterior motive. It would have something that it was trying to do by disseminating this information. And so what we don't want to happen is for an owner, I'm being a little dramatic, I recognize, but not too much, an owner to be sending out with an ulterior motive of maximizing profit, not serving the public, and we begin to see information that that follows a party line or a company line. That's what I am on the lookout for.
Yeah, thank you. I think the last question for the panel, and then we'll open it up. For those that are concerned about what is happening with the FCC rule changes, where is the most appropriate place for people in this room to voice that? Is it the FCC? Is it somewhere else? Where would people kind of say, hey, we're not okay with this? What does that look like?
Well, I can tell you that our state attorney general has gone on record saying that if the merger goes through, he's going to review it. And if he finds that it harms Coloradans, then he'll do ... something. Keep the pressure on him. And if he becomes our next governor, he'll be in a different office in which he might be able to do something. So that's one public official who's on record saying to the press when they asked, I'm interested in it, I'm concerned about it. We can hold that public official accountable for those remarks. That's one place.
It's too late the deadline has passed for FCC comment. You could still Google FCC public comment and find it and maybe, and turn it in. It may or may not get paid attention to, but lawmakers at the federal level also, I think our representatives here, Joe Neguse has written a letter. I think Senator Bennett has either jointly or separately written a letter about this particular merger situation. So yes, definitely reaching out to your representatives is really the best thing that you could probably do now if you have something to voice.
Keep making antitrust a bipartisan issue. Talk to the people who might think differently than you about other things and come together around this. Remember, in 1892, Colorado elected a populist governor, the Populist Party, a third-party governor. And it was that movement that really helped, around the country, but we were a real hotbed of it. It was that movement that made antitrust law a thing in the first place. And then its successors brought that energy into the development of public media regulation and investments in public radio and public broadcasting and these sorts of things. So keep talking with folks about it. keep insisting that, this is not something that has to be, on my side or your side. This is kind of where we can have common ground. And this is where we can build bridges across lines.
Thank you. So just wondering if anyone has any questions. We have a few.
How do you determine if a news source is trustworthy?
That is a great question. Who would like to tackle that?
Of course, it's a relationship. It's part of it. And that's part of why local ownership matters so much, is because you develop a relationship over time with these people, and you might run into them. You interact with them. I've run into reporters in my community. I the head of one of our new nonprofit news organizations in Boulder, we drop off kids together all the time. I can ask her, why'd you do it that way? It's a relationship when it's done right. And then second, when it's a bigger thing and it's not, it's more of a parasocial relationship, honestly, I always start by trying to figure out who owns the thing. What's their accountability structure? What's their bottom line? Do they have a reason to earn my trust in their structure? And it's not a guarantee, but it's at least a pretty strong signal. If they're owned in a way that suggests that they understand and they're structured as a public good, as opposed to they're structured to maximize profits for somebody who's far, far away. That's a good start.
And they also correct their mistakes. They have real people whose names are attached to the reporting. You can contact them in some way. Just some little things to be on the lookout for. And you can also, Corey, were you going to talk about the map? Go ahead.
No. Oh, yeah. Well, I could. Yeah. So you could go to Colab. You give the website.
colabnews.co. In the upper right-hand corner, click on Find Your Local News.
Yeah. In that we have mapped where residents have told us they're getting their local news and information in all 64 counties. I'll tell you something else, but it's not easy. But you could go through this checklist and ask yourself when you're reading something, to what extent can I get a sense that this has an obligation to the truth, that it has a loyalty to the public, that it follows a discipline of verification, that it's independent from what it's covering, and that it's comprehensive and proportional. And if it can meet plenty of those, then that's pretty much nowadays how I feel like I have to analyze every piece of content that comes across my eyeballs.
And does it inform you instead of inflame you?
Yeah. And I will just add one thing. If you find a outlet that you trust, I would encourage you to support them. Even if it is, you can get all of their content for free. Support those reporters, support those outlets, because that is how we continue to make sure that we have local coverage in Colorado, is that support. So that is just really important. And share. I mean, if you identify, hey, this is where I go to for my news, share that with those people that are in your life and say, this is where I get my news from, so that they have access to really good information as well.
Two quick questions for Ethan. What is it about Colorado that makes it unique among the states for collaborative or cooperative news outlets?
Well, it's really much beyond news outlets. It's for any kind of business. And there are two main driving forces. One is the agricultural cooperative community that pushed forward some really innovative laws a couple decades ago that made us kind of, in some ways, the Delaware of cooperatives. It's where cooperatives from all around the country come to incorporate just because we have the best statutes. So that's one piece. And so that's really the ag folks who did that. And then second is our governor. Jared Polis, you may not know, actually announced his campaign at a employee-owned grocery store in the Springs. And as soon as he became elected governor, he created a commission to advance employee ownership in the state. That commission has turned into a permanent body at OEDIT, the economic development arm of the state, and then he and other lawmakers have passed laws to put money behind supporting employee ownership conversions. And the motivation for that is not just a problem in journalism. We have what's called a silver tsunami going on right now, where businesses of all kinds don't have succession plans. The vast majority of them do not have succession plans, and that is a critical threat to the economic health of our communities. It goes way beyond news. And so employee ownership is a strategy. Hey, you can't find a rich person to buy your business. You got the people who know your business best are working for it. How can we make sure that these businesses stay in their communities, whatever they're doing, and continue to enrich those communities through worker ownership? That's the goal that our state has really been leading on. I'm always on calls with people around the country who are trying to figure out how to do what we've done here in Colorado where they are. Our challenge is still often how to get the word out, how to make sure owners understand the dynamics of these models. And sometimes they really misunderstand them, and that gets in the way. And that actually became an issue in Boulder with the Boulder Weekly. That's a more complicated story that Corey's told very well.
Okay, thank you, Ethan. Laura, I have to come back to the alarming statistic you gave of 1.35 journalists per newspaper. And I'm a statistician. Perhaps you could comment on what you see as the validity of that number for the audience to view as a typical newspaper.
Yeah, I'll give you an example. Probably you're all familiar with the Aurora Sentinel. Aurora's the third largest city in our state. I think we can all agree there's a lot of news that happens and has happened in Aurora. They have 3 people in their newsroom to cover the entire city of Aurora. And then when you get out, most of Colorado is pretty rural, and a large number of our news organizations are family-owned news organizations. I'm thinking of places like the Ouray County Plain Dealer, owned by...
Or Lake City, as Corey cited.
Lake City.
And I think that's the... I'll interrupt you, I'm sorry,
No, go ahead,
but
go
we've been long. That is the important context to give with that statistic. No one is saying that Fort Collins newspaper has 1.3. I mean, the important context is Colorado, as Corey alluded to, is made up of many very small towns with weekly newspapers. So if we, and I don't know the data, I just know that many people might walk away thinking, oh, wow, Fort Collins has 1.3 journalists. I hope not. And you've now clarified that. And I'll just close with that, Corey, I really appreciated your apparently keeping track of all these newspapers in Colorado. And it would be interesting from a research perspective, and probably it's already happened, to judge what kinds of local newspapers are most likely to cover well local issues.
Well, I track it every week. You can find it at coloradomedia.substack.com. And I'll just add, again, I didn't say this before, but I'm only able to do that work through underwriting from Colorado Media Project and others in the media sphere. And again, without what happened in 2018 with what Alden Global Capital did to the Denver Post, I don't know if I do this every week. So despite everything that we saw there, I think it's really important to walk away from this to see how Colorado responded to what Alden Global Capital did. And that's really why we're all here in this room today and why you can hear from people like us.
I just want to take a moment to thank our panelists and ask you all for your applause for our wonderful contributions. Thank you so much, Kimberly, for your moderation.
Thank you.
And I want to thank you all for coming out this evening. There was a moment in which we paused after everything that happened this weekend to make sure that this was still the important conversation that we wanted it to be. And it was. And we are so grateful to have you in our space and listening and thinking and hopefully taking action from here. So thank you for being with us this evening. We hope to see you again. Thank you all.
Thank you.